So on my recent visit to the Netherlands, I came across this windmill in the back of my parents' house and managed to do one outdoor painting, but I wasn't really happy with the outcome. It was fun to do, but wasn't really at the level that I was hoping for, so I decided to repaint it in the studio and share it with you. So it's ready for me to apply my sky color, cerulean blue, a touch of cobalt. It's a bright sunny sky, which is quite unusual for these parts of the world, but I lucked out. But I am gonna pop in a few clouds. It just makes it a little bit more interesting. That's the light there reflecting. It looks like a big white patch, but there is color there, as you will see as it dries out a bit. And because the sun is coming in from the right, I've made the top left corner a little bit darker. I always advocate for graded washes wherever, never flat colors, unless that's your style. With raw sienna, I'm going straight into my trees and cover that little house. And that's just that I don't really want a pure white for that house. It'll be bright enough against the dark trees. The windmill, I'm just covering it with a tiny bit of blue because even white will have a color and it's in shade. I'm going to move straight down to the bright sunny patch of the grass, and that's almost a pure Indian yellow that I'm using there. So it's got a warm bias to it. And then as I'm moving down the page, I've picked up a bit of my sky blue where the shadow goes. And I'm using a set of Fumui brushes, by the way, and you can find a link in my description. There's even the discount code. I've let that completely dry. That's all I had to do for my first wash. And you can see that there are some subtle clouds happening almost randomly by itself. I've mixed a weak purple wash, a little bit of burnt sienna into my sky blue, and that's all I need for those very distant trees surrounding that smaller windmill. And the challenge here is to get some variation into the tree line, not to make a zigzag line or a wave. Now I've mixed two greens, a warmer yellower one and a darker bluer one, using my staple colors of ultramarine blue, quinacridone gold, and then in the darker mix I would have added a touch of my red, neutralize it and pull it into a darker value. And then I'm going to paint my main mid-value shape, which is that big mass of trees. That's our backdrop for the mill and the little house. And I'm going to change between the lighter and the darker green, again to get that variation even within one color. That is a surefire way of getting interest into your paintings. So this is one of those fundamental lessons that I will apply and preach over and over again. This is what makes a watercolor look like a watercolor. I'm not a fan of, flat washes that have one solid color. That is a distinct style. It's a bit too graphic for me. It's like graphic design. I like watercolor that flows and moves and has pigments interacting with each other. So working with 2 or 3 different variations of your color, especially for larger shapes like this one, will just instantly add a lot of life and interest to it. Now I gotta definitely be careful to paint around my whites. This is almost a case for masking fluid or strips of masking tape, but I always like to put the challenge to myself to paint around these shapes. I'm obviously using my smaller brush for this kind of work, and it has to be one that can come to quite a fine point. So I'm paying attention to my top and bottom edges of this shape, because edges often define the texture of a shape, whether it's hard or soft or spiky. So with trees, there's got to be a balance between, not too many leaves, but still giving the impression of there are trees with branches and leaves. The brush selection there is quite crucial because you won't, get the same effect with different brushes. So you got to be confident that the brush you're using will give you the edge that you want. And that takes, again, a bit of experimentation. So use what you are comfortable with and what you know will give you the desired effect. I often use Chinese calligraphy brushes for this type of work, but I really wanted to try out these Fumui brushes. And I must say they are giving me quite a nice edge. Good rule of thumb is to have the biggest contrast around your points of interest, which is the white mill and the little house. So I will continue to ensure that there is enough value contrast, dropping in a few more shadows into the trees themselves, just to further that variation, and more details to the edges, a few flyaway branches and clusters of leaves. And while it's wet, of course, I'm going to scratch in some tree trunks. Use a palette knife for that. The consistency is just right. It's not too wet, it's not too dry. And then, using what's already on my palette, I'm going to glaze over my foreground. That initial bright yellow that we used in the first wash, obviously it's dried quite a bit lighter, but it will still shine through and give us a lovely warm glow. And now I'm just going to build up my foreground using the colors I've already got. For now, I'm going to turn my attention to my little building, and I've got a light grey there, mixed again out of what's already on the palette, added a tiny bit of cerulean blue to it. And even though it looks white, as you may remember from the first wash, we did tint it with a very light sort of raw sienna, so it's not entirely the white of the page, but bright enough to give us the impression of the sunlight hitting a white building. And I've just pulled a shadow line under the roof. And I'm going to do the same for the windmill, a bluish grey on the shadow side, and then wetting that edge just with clean water. I want soft edge. This is a round building, so we want to have soft transitions between shadow and light. I'm dipping a bit into my lavender there because I want that shadow edge to be noticeable, so not too light, but I'm carefully building up that color. I'm going to add my dark color for the top of the windmill. I have to paint around that blade there, and there is also a wooden support that connects the front of the windmill with the turning device. Just gonna draw in the blades of the other windmill while I've got it on my brush. Just gonna draw very subtle, just enough for it to be noticed. And then also that shadow line on that roof is a bit too weak considering how strong the sun is. So I'm just going to strengthen that shadow there as well. And then I'm going to pop in a little window. And now I'm going to come to the big one, which is the foreground shadow. That will really ground this painting and create the light that we need. And as you can see, I had a strip of paper there. I want to make sure I've got the right temperature and the right strength. And spoiler alert, I didn't get it right. I will have to do this twice, but that's okay. That'll give us another layer of depth to the shadow. Ideally, this would have been right the first time round and have very loose expressive brush strokes. There's a bit of dappled light there at the edges. These are trees that we can't see that cast this shadow, so at the edge of the shadow is where it breaks up, but it's going to dry too light and not give me the desired effect. I'm already getting a sense of that, so I'm starting to mix in a bit more ultramarine blue, and I also didn't mix enough. Another common mistake I make, and especially beginners make, not mixing enough of a color that you need a lot of, and then you have to remix it, and painting starts drying while you're remixing it, and that's when all the accidents happen. But I keep my mixes relatively simple, so it doesn't take me long to remix the color. I know the ratios, and I had to do this as well because I want to pull the shadow straight into that foreground tree that's coming in, which is also mostly a compositional device, something to lock off the right side of the painting to give us depth, give us a foreground that will give us the 3D effect of the midground, because the painting really all happens on one plane at the moment, which is where the trees and the windmill is, and that's quite flat. So we need something that's in the foreground that gives us the sense that there's depth in the field, and so we can judge the distance from the bottom edge to the windmill, and a tree in shadow will help with that. While that's drying, I mixed some dark red. This is quite a dry mix now. I don't want this to run because the blades of the windmill have got sails on them and they're red. They're currently rolled up because obviously the windmill isn't spinning. Oh, not obviously, you can't see it. It could. It's still painting, but the windmill isn't spinning. The sails aren't up. It's locked. But the red gives us a nice little accent, especially against the green, because yes, it's the complementary color. Coming back to a darker mix to pop in my windows and my door of the windmill. Can't be too dark, otherwise I'll have a hole like the eyes in a sheet to make a ghost. We don't want that. We want them to look like windows and doors. They just catch a bit of shadow. It's better to start light and then darken it if needed, rather than go in with, a really dark color or a black or something. But what I am going to do is I'm going to add a shadow that just adds to the depth of it and a bit of interest. So it's the cast shadow from that beam onto the windmill because the sun's still quite high. There is a bit of shadow that's cast by one of the blades. I've talked a bit about broken edges. So we want to anchor our elements into a painting or connect them. And currently the two straight edges of the building in the mill aren't doing that. But my plan all along was to include the fence. A cast shadow under that fence. So I stay consistent with my shadows. And I've popped in a little door on that shadow side of the building and a window. It was looking a little bit too bland. With my rigger, I'm also going to add a few branches here and there, just to continue that illusion of trees, just connecting where the white scratches are. And I'm going to also add some branches to the foreground tree there, just to add a little bit more detail. This is in the foreground, so we want to make sure there is a level of detail without distracting. And as promised, I'm going to glaze over my shadow with almost the same strength as before, because if I just layer the same value over the top, then it should achieve the right darkness for me. And you can see I'm almost running into the same problem, that I'm not mixing enough of that color. And I'm trying to match the pattern as much as possible. It doesn't matter if I don't exactly paint the same shadow. That'll add to the idea of dappled light coming through the trees, where some shadows are lighter than others. And definitely want to make sure I have some sunny patches, some gaps in there, and some edges where the trees end. I really want to create that strong illusion that we're standing in the shadow and we're squinting into the sun. As you can see, it really needed that darkness, that strong value in the foreground for this painting to work. And here it is. Thanks for watching. Please like this video if you enjoyed my painting. On my Patreon page, there's also a longer version of this tutorial, along with the reference photo for download and plenty other tutorials you won't find here on YouTube.